So the next major event that we looked at was the Great Depression, in terms of a challenge that free market capitalism faced. The 1920s, before the Great Depression, were a time of just incredible optimism. The economy around the world was improving to levels never seen before. Coming out of the First World War, the war that was supposed to end all wars, there was just this incredible sense of hope and optimism that would never happen again. Things would be great forever. And businesses were doing exceptionally well, in part due to the stock market, right? The stock market being this system where companies can raise money from individuals who would invest some of their money into little pieces of the company. If the company did well, those people who invested also end up making money on those investments. But because there was so much incredible optimism, people were buying stocks and shares in companies with money they didn't even have. This was called buying on margin, borrowing money to buy stocks. And this was very widespread. So if something did happen to the stock market, not only did people lose money they had, people lost money they didn't have, which banks relied on. And we'll get to that in a second. Because of this optimism, manufacturing was also producing goods at a rate never seen before, which led to some overproduction. So if we remember supply and demand, when you have enough goods to satisfy what people are buying, if you have enough goods to satisfy the demand, enough supply to satisfy the demand, then prices are going to reflect what those things are worth. If all of a sudden companies are producing more than people can buy, you have this situation of overproduction where all of a sudden the demand is much lower than the supply. Right? So a little bit of this was happening in the 1920s. Again, because of this optimism that people would be buying this stuff, that things would be good forever. What also started happening in the 1920s was a bit of friction in the realm of free trade around the world, where the United States started to try and protect some of its industry in the United States by introducing tariffs, which would increase the goods of foreign imports to help US companies compete. However, once the United States started doing that, other countries started to retaliate, and all of a sudden it was harder for American companies to export their goods. So all of these things were starting to really put some pressure on this economic growth that was happening. And on October 29th, 1929, we had what was called the stock market crash, where a chain of events led to people all of a sudden lose this incredible optimism that they had. There were a series of poor harvests leading to bad returns on things like agricultural investments, and this overproduction was starting to catch up to society, where businesses all of a sudden had to start selling their goods for less and so weren't making as much money, and that showed friction in the stock market. And then once people started to lose that sense of optimism that things would continuously get better, they started to sell their stocks. And as soon as that little bit of panic happened, lots of people started to panic and sell their stocks. And this spiraled downwards into the stock market crash that ended up resulting in the Great Depression, or that triggered the Great Depression. And that stock market crash also led to the failure of a lot of banks in the United States, because again, people had borrowed money to invest in the stock market, and well, that money was coming from banks. All of a sudden, once people lost that money, banks couldn't get that money back. And as people were starting to lose faith in the banks, they were pulling their money out of banks. So all of a sudden, banks just straight up didn't have any money anymore. And if banks don't have money, businesses can't borrow money to grow their businesses. A lot of businesses had loans. As a result, lots of businesses failed. And unemployment skyrocketed as businesses started to fail, to a point where, almost 1 in 4 or 5 Americans was unemployed. And capitalism had to find a way to adapt once again. And the responses that we've seen came from a competing set of economic beliefs, right? We talked about the economist Friedrich Hayek, who believed that the economy would right itself, that eventually free market principles, even though they might cause a little bit of pain in the short term, would end up fixing the economy over time, that if, government still stays out of it, things would be okay. The competing economic idea, which was kind of new at the time, came from John Maynard Keynes, who believed that if the government acts during a recession, that if the government spends money on trying to put people back to work, that's actually going to shorten that amount of time it'll take to recover, because people will have jobs again, people will be able to spend money again. If people spend money, businesses do better, and the time from recession to recovery gets a little bit shorter. And overall, his idea needs money, right? The government needs to have some sort of savings in order to be able to spend money during a downturn. So overall, Keynes proposed that during a period when there's a boom, the government would actually maybe increase taxes. It's going to be less impactful to people if they're doing well anyway to be paying a little bit more in taxes. The government then saves that money to have in order to spend during a recession. So when we look at the business cycle again, what happens is that you still have those peaks and valleys. You still have this boom and bust cycle happening. But what actually happens is that the top of that boom and bust ends up shrinking a little bit, and the bottom ends up shrinking a little bit too. So the overall trajectory is the same. You might feel the boom a little bit less, but at the same time, you feel the bust or the recession a little bit less too. And overall, if less people are unemployed, if the economy isn't struggling as much during a recession, it still makes it a little bit better overall, even though those booms might end up being a little bit lower. That's what President Franklin Delano Roosevelt ran his election campaign on against Herbert Hoover at the height of the Great Depression. Roosevelt called this program the New Deal, and it was entirely based on these Keynesian economic principles where you spend money, put people back to work, take care of people, introduce things like Social Security, old age pensions, right? Old age pensions mean that, once you're older, you can retire knowing that you are going to be okay with money from the government, which means people are going to retire early, which means that younger people are going to have the ability to fill some of those jobs, right? So it aims to fix unemployment that way as well. The quote around that was, men may differ as to the particular form of governmental activity with respect to industry and business, but nearly all men are agreed that private enterprise in times such as these cannot be left without assistance and without reasonable safeguards. Let it destroy not only itself, but also processes of civilization. Right? So capitalism overall still a good thing, but there needs to be a system in place in order to make it fair for everybody. Or, as Roosevelt said, it would basically destroy civilization entirely if left entirely unchecked. Another type of economic system that basically the polar opposite of capitalism we saw develop in the Soviet Union at roughly the same times. And we call the economic system of the Soviet Union a command economy. So some of the principles of a command economy are that the economy is pretty much entirely run by the government. So trade, entirely run by the government. Wages, set by the government. Industries that people work in, set by the government. Where factories should go, how factories should develop, entirely set by the government. The first iteration of this was in the early Soviet Union under Vladimir Lenin and his policy of war communism, where to finish the war, World War I, and eventually the Civil War that followed, industry had to be entirely nationalized. So Lenin took control of everything, agricultural production, grain production, everything, in order to feed the war effort. After the Civil War finished, Lenin relaxed some of those policies, allowed a little bit of free enterprise again, small business. Most of it was still fully nationalized, big business anyway. And we called this the new economic policy. When Stalin took over, he decided that the economy and the Soviet Union needed to modernize rapidly. The Soviet Union was still, for the most part, an agricultural society, and in order to compete with these new modern industrial societies of Western Europe, things needed to happen fast, according to Joseph Stalin. And he introduced these government-controlled 5-year plans, where quotas would be set, targets would be set, that at the end of those 5 years, the Soviet economy would have to industrialize and modernize rapidly. And this was entirely controlled by the government. The most destructive part of Stalin's 5-year plan policies was the collectivization of agriculture, where wealthy farmers, especially in the Ukraine, these farmers were known as kulaks, resisted, and Stalin couldn't take resistance at all. And a lot of these farmers were forcibly removed from their land, sent to work camps, prison camps called gulags. And as a result of a lot of these policies of collectivization, millions of people, especially in the Ukraine, died. And what we've seen with command economies in the Soviet Union is that over time, they led to a lot of stagnation. So while the 5-year plans did manage to industrialize the Soviet Union pretty quick, once that modernization happened, that lack of competition, that lack of a profit motive, if you will, in individuals led to stagnation, where without competition, there was no drive to improve on goods. There was no drive to make things better. And this is exemplified in, for example, in East Germany, the Trabant, which was a mass-produced car under East Germany's command economy that, you know, if you bought it in the 1960s, it looked virtually identical if you bought it in the 1980s. Today, most countries operate under what we call a mixed economy. What we mean by a mixed economy is that generally these countries are capitalist and embrace most of the elements of free market capitalism, but include some elements of that socialism, some elements of, you know, those command principles, that government intervention in order to make things a little bit better for people. And at the end, this is seen as actually making the capitalist system better. Because if you think of things like old age pensions, right, means people can retire a little bit earlier, which means more younger people have jobs. That helps the capitalist system. If we think about universal health care, sure, the government has to spend a little bit of money on that, but if people are sick for a shorter period of time because they can get the health care they need without having to worry about the cost, that means they're going to go back to work sooner. And that ends up helping the capitalist economy. If we think about employment insurance, if people lose their job but have a little bit of help from the government, that means they're able to find a job in their field possibly faster and don't have to necessarily take part-time jobs that might not be where their expertise lies, and instead, you know, focus on being able to work to the best of their ability in what they were trained for in looking for a new job. Right? So when we combine different elements of these different capitalist systems, we actually have seen that that makes the capitalist system more efficient and more effective. And different countries look at that in different ways, right? So countries like the United States still have a little bit more of those free market beliefs than, say, Canada or places like Sweden. Even China, which is a communist country, is still a mixed economy, in that they've seen that certain free market elements in terms of competition and profit motive help their economy, even though there's still considerably more government control and they lean more towards that command economy side of the equation. But at the end of the day, most countries now operate under what we call a mixed economy. And that wraps up our review of economic systems. Thank you for tuning in to this edition of Korchik's class, and we will see you again next time.